You are so far from being alone. And the more we normalize this, the more we realize we can talk about sex in a way that's still professional, that's still classy, that's still wonderfully orchestrated. And it's just, we're talking about it in a way that's just like anything else in health that's out of balance. There's still like a lot of slut shaming going around where men can have all of these partners and women, if they do it, is looked upon like they're bad or dirty or trash, rather than, hey, just like men, these are, humans that also are really enjoying pleasure and their own sexuality. The most common reported orgasm now about 40% of women show that they have a report having a longer orgasm, which is more like, I see some people reporting like internal surveys they're doing from their audience saying as few as 15% of women can have orgasms from intercourse only. Some studies are saying 70% of women can have orgasms from intercourse only. Regardless, even if the 70% is true, that still leaves almost a third of women that are not able to orgasm from intercourse alone. And that's for many different reasons. Some of the reasons I think is because simple thing around like, hey everybody, this episode of The Lounge, we're talking about sexual stats, facts, and this is such an important episode because I like bringing some of these stats and facts to you because when we do, it normalizes things, right? It normalizes the discussion that we're having. And one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast, one of the reasons for my libido work is really to bring these conversations to the light, to help make these conversations around sex be professional, classy, less taboo, because so many people have a level of sexual dysfunction in their own life, in their intimate life. And many couples are not even talking to each other about it. So many times when something starts like not working or not feeling well, then there's just this like brush it under the rug and we don't talk about it and we just don't have sex anymore thing that happens. And people are generally not talking to their friends about this. It's like not a classic dinner party conversation. I mean, it might be in like my friend group, but in most friends groups, it's not a classic dinner party conversation to say, hey, we're having a hard time with our sex life right now. So what does that lead? It's like, if you think about so many other things in medicine, like it's very common for friends to get together and say, oh, I'm having back pain. And another friend's like, oh yeah, I'm having like neck pain or I'm having hip pain. And you can see some level of like compassion and validation and feel like you're not alone in the world. And with sex and any sort of sexual dysfunction or sexual abnormalities or just challenges, whatever we want to call it, it's not like we are getting that validation, even though it is such a common problem. So I'm going to break down some of these stats for you. But one of the takeaways I hope you get from today's episode is you're not alone. You are so far from being alone. And the more we normalize this, the more we realize we can talk about sex in a way that's still professional, that's still classy, that's still wonderfully orchestrated. And it's just, we're talking about it in a way that's just like anything else in health that's out of balance. The more we can get there, the more we can normalize this conversation, make it less taboo, and the more we can have these relationships that are really helping us to have sex for the rest of our lives. Like most people typically do have an interest in having sex for the rest of their lives at some point. Now, what will wind up happening to so many people is they get to a point and they're bored, it hurts, it doesn't work, it's a source of tension, and they just say, whatever, I don't even need it. But when we look at studies on all that it does for relationships, on all that it heals, on all that it does for keeping couples bonded, for helping make that relationship strong, for helping with anything from things like anxiety, depression, sleep, mental stability, energy, and so much more, we can see even bone growth, right? There's even a level of sex and oxytocin helping with bone growth. There's so many different things. So we see all that. it's so easy to see why this is such an important part of health. We have sex, we have our pleasure receptors for a reason. These are God-given receptors that we have for a reason. So let's go through. So I have my notes here. I have all the things that I want to say to you about these stats. So let's just talk about ejaculation to start for men. So what is normal? Normal is anywhere from about a quarter teaspoon all the way up to a teaspoon of ejaculate. So that's about normal. A common question too is like, well, how far does it go? Well, there's not a really good reliable source that I can find on like the average distance, but one thing that can happen is the look of the force and how far it looks like it's going can be related to how much semen is actually coming out, right? So if there's more, it might look like it has more of a movement than if there's less, sort of thing. Orgasm. So women's orgasms, the most common reported orgasm it's called a short orgasm. It lasts for about 3 to 15 seconds. Very, very, very short. Now, about 40% of women show that they have a report having a longer orgasm, which is more like 30 to 60 seconds. So one of the things that can happen and so many times as women, we're not taught things, and men are not taught this either, of like how to make that orgasm deeper and go longer. So the more we can kind of ride that edge, like edging, and that concept of edging, of getting close to orgasming and pulling back, and close to orgasm and pulling back, that's talked a lot about for men's health. But I think because women can have the capacity of having multiple orgasms, and a woman can orgasm and still have sex with the man, and he can still begin like her parts are still working, right? I think there's less emphasis for women on this concept of edging. Now, one of the things that we can see is as women, when you get close to climax and you pull back and close to climax, and just before you're about to get to that point of no return, if you pull back, that can actually help with a better and longer and more sustained orgasm. So this practice can be done like by solo, with your solo masturbation practice. And it can also be done with communicating to a partner. So the biggest thing, and I talk in other videos about, that we see with orgasm, one of the biggest important things is for women is getting to that thing that's working. So you can try all these different things, positions, techniques, all these different things. And then when you find something that's really working and you're like that arousal's going up, you want to stay consistent with that one thing, right? You want to stay with that technique if you switch that technique right as orgasm is about to occur, all of a sudden that'll reset her nerves, and you might have to kind of start with building up that arousal again. But if you're following me here, this is actually a really good edging technique for women. So what you can do is, if you're feeling like, oh, your orgasms are shorter and you want longer sustained orgasms, one practice you can do is getting yourself closer and closer to climax, and keep with that same technique that's kind of getting you aroused. And right before you kind of get to that point of no return, tap your partner, give them a wink, whatever the sign is, that all of a sudden they switch to a different technique right then. And if they switch to a different technique, typically that will lower that like kind of arousal threshold, and you'll have to build it up again. But if you do that several times before you allow yourself over the edge, then typically that orgasm is going to be much longer and much more sustained. And the longer and more sustained it is, typically, like the more pleasure women feel, typically is related to more and more and more of their desire to come back and have sex again, right? So that desire, that kind of that pleasure awakens all the dopamine receptors in the brain that say, that was really good. I kind of want more of that. It's kind of like, how anybody that tries not to eat sugar and hopefully succeeds. And one of the things that can happen for a lot of people with sugar is like, you're really good at like saying no to it. And then all of a sudden you have one bite of everything or of something with sugar. And it's like, oh, that turns the receptors on in the brain. That's like, I want more of that. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe I can get away with another bite, or maybe I can get away with another bite. And sooner than later, all of a sudden sugar's crept back in. That's in part because that's wakening up that dopamine pathway in your brain that says, this is good, I want more. Sex is no different, except it's very different because it's actually good for us. But from the standpoint of the dopamine, that's what's happening is when you're having that longer pleasure, that's triggering the brain to say, I want more of that. So those longer sustained orgasms can really help you get that desire map is kind of turned back on. So female ejaculation. So this comes up sometimes online. It's like, how do I ejaculate? How do I ejaculate? How do I ejaculate as a woman? In general, my feeling about female ejaculation is sometimes I think there's so much emphasis on this that it almost kind of takes away from the other pleasure of the moment. But it's estimated that maybe up to 70% of women actually ejaculate, but many of them, the ejaculate goes backwards into their bladder. So this is an important thing because so many people, so many women and couples I find are like, okay, well, let's figure out how to do this. This seems really sexy and cool. But for some women, you're never going to see it because there's a tendency of that ejaculate